to the forum of the Institute of Politics, the Kennedy School of Government. My name is Charles Royer. I'm the director of the Institute, and it's my pleasure again this evening to introduce the introducer, who will give us something of a brief synopsis of last night's Tanner lecture and make the introduction for tonight's lecture. To introduce our distinguished lecturer, we're very pleased to have with us Professor Daniel Bell, the Henry Ford II Professor of Social Sciences Emeritus, who will make the introduction. Professor Bell.
I'm very pleased to be in the chair, or I should say out of the chair, for a friend of long standing and a colleague, Ernest Gellner. The function of a chairman in all these situations is in part ceremonial, and we all accept that as part of the ritual of praise which we want to, in a sense, bestow upon our speaker because that is his due. I've also been asked not only to take part in the ceremonial, but to some extent play an instrumental role, which is to provide a quick reprise for those of you who may not have been here last night. It's a rather daunting challenge, I suspect, and when I mentioned to Ernest that I would do this, he said, "Fine, I'd like to see how I've been misunderstood." My friend Ernest Gellner is an anthropologist in the grand manner, because he takes as his canvas the sweep of civilizations and cultures as the field of his interest. With Comte, for example, on the nature of social evolution, as he has in his recent book, The Plow, the Sword, and the Book, which is a way of looking at trisecting the history of Western thought and Western civilization, and in the kind of comparative sociology he does, as he began to indicate last night, taking as a sweep the notion of the Atlantic civilizations as those which encompassed civil society, and then Muslim societies and the Marxist states. Endeavors in their sweep which go back to some extent to people like Kroeber or Sorokin, and in their details to Max Weber. But all these analyses are rooted in intellectual history. In the first lecture, though the focus was indeed on the most contemporary of all problems, the disintegration of the communist states and the resurgence of Islam, he drew his clues and his working hypotheses from Machiavelli, Tocqueville, Fustel de Coulanges, and David Hume. Recently, to my surprise, a Harvard teacher mocked the reading of these dead thinkers on the ground they did not give us relevant facts to understand the present-day world. Facts surely are necessary, but what seemed to have escaped his notice is that the more relevant issue is how you gather the facts together in some conceptual and analytical scheme for purposes of hypotheses and explanation, and, for a word which Professor Gellner used consistently last night, argument, which after all is a term of rhetoric. It reminded me, in fact, of a situation many years ago. A former teacher of mine at the City College of New York, Professor Morris Raphael Cohn, a philosopher, who was challenged by a student who said, "Professor Cohn, prove to me I should study logic." And Cohn said, "And how would you know it's a good proof?" So there's still some education to be done here at Harvard as well. Professor Gellner began with a puzzle, much like Weber asking why capitalism developed in the West rather than the Orient. His question is, in fact, that the idea of civil society and the existence of civil societies developed in the Atlantic civilizations, but is lacking both in the Marxist states and the Muslim societies. Further, one has been collapsing, the other has been apparently strengthening. Therefore, why? How come? There are two background points of Professor Gellner's exposition. One is the idea laid out in his book, Legitimation of Belief, that there are distinctive styles of thought which express the experiences of cultures and which become organized as worldviews. And the second is the premise, which most of us have accepted, that religions have been the dominant frame of these worldviews. But in the West, it's been challenged by secularization, in its most extreme form in the Soviet states and in their resistant forms in the Muslim societies. In order to look at this extraordinary paradox of this dichotomy of secularization and the way it's developed, he began with Machiavelli as a basic thinker. Machiavelli was a man who believed in the use of religion for state purposes, not for its supernatural validity, but for its power as myth, for unifying the masses and cementing their morals. But he also pointed out that Machiavelli had defined two different types of societies, one which were highly unitary in a centralized regime, and the other which were fragmented, and raised the question which one of these were more susceptible to be overcome and which ones had the greatest strength. From there he moved for a second clue to Tocqueville. And to many people's surprise, I suspect, he pointed out that Tocqueville had gone to Algeria right after coming back from the United States in the 1830s. In fact, Algeria was an area much more important to France than the United States, because Algeria was a place which could be colonized, an area which by and large was a place where France could exploit its neighbor or the place there more readily than coming to the United States. There had also been the fact of the conquest of Algeria under the war against Abd el-Qadar. Tocqueville himself thought that Islam was a decadent and distasteful belief, but he appreciated the communal solidarities, particularly the Kabyles, the Berbers, and the Arabs, and the religious strength of these societies. His third clue came from Fustel de Coulanges, a man less well known than the other two, who had been a professor of ancient history at the Sorbonne in the latter half of the 19th century. Fustel is largely known for his classic work called The Ancient City, a study of Greece, and primarily the notion that the nature of belief is the element which holds together a city, and it's when that city, where belief has been fused with family and gene and fratry, when that city, which is for him a religious association, begins to wear thin, that in effect societies begin to disintegrate. But his strongest clue came, interesting enough, from David Hume, a man who himself was a skeptic, and to some extent almost a Pyrrhonist, but who believed that, as we would say functionally, that religion was necessary as a kind of way of holding a society together. But Hume pointed out that in this situation there was a contradiction. There were religions which in effect had a unitary belief, which had a strong strength based on the enthusiasm of its holders, and then there was the folk elements of superstition and such, the popular elements. And here became the transition to the notion of Muslim societies, namely that in the last part of his exposition, towards the conclusion, Professor Gellner made the point that one of the elements of Muslim societies is there was no such contradiction as Hume found in the West, that there was a unitary belief system which united both those on top, the elites, and those who professed the beliefs and expressed them, and the communal groups below who were able to live it out in their own lives. And that became the end point of his exposition. I think he will develop some of that tonight and then move on to the other problem of the contradictions of Marxist societies.
Thank you very much, Dan. I was looking forward to filling up some of the time by criticizing the misunderstandings, but there aren't any, so that gives me a bigger task. But thank you for this masterly summary. As Dan said, politely said, in the grand manner, the less polite way would be saying, I'm just going to drop the mask. This is a brazenly megalomaniac enterprise. What I'm trying to do is offer a sort of global theory of human societies and human history in order to locate our specific problem in it. Whether I got it, well, the chances of getting it right are very small, but I hope at least I've asked the right questions so that one can pursue the matter further. And I've put I've tried to sum up the crude elements which go into the scheme on the board. It's if you like, on the top in the horizontal dimension, I've put the three activities which I think are the crucial activities human beings and human societies go in for, namely coercion, or it's a slightly too pejorative a word. Coercion includes the maintenance of minimal order in society, to give it a slightly more positive connotation, but coercion is a shorter expression. Coercion, production, and the cluster of things which I use the short word of belief, but which of course includes legitimation, the provision of the conceptual order which enables people to organize things, and legitimate things and accept them. These are the seems to be the three central activities, but their relationship to each other takes a variety of forms, and the sequence, which I put on the left, is more of a topology than an attempt at historical periodicization. There are certain underlying principles in using that typology, and the typology is generated by a certain number of assumptions which I hold to be correct, but which of course are contentious. The first one is, and this of course is very much in disagreement, in contrast to the central intuition of Marxism, the first contention is that the pursuit of power in society is more important, incidentally for very rational reasons, than the pursuit of economic growth or increase in production. From the viewpoint of any individual or any subgroup in society, the enhancement of the productive potential of society is much less interesting, because it's long-term, they only get a share of it. What is really to the advantage of individuals and subgroups is to improve their position in their society. And so on the whole, societies are not oriented, ethoses and sort of outlooks and aims are not oriented towards wealth enhancement, even if people knew how to do it, which very frequently, of course, they don't. Proposition 1. From this follows a risky but I think important generalization about the whole of the agrarian world. I've left out the pre-agrarian world of foragers, where there's no political structure to speak of because the community is too small, and the ordinary relationship of the community and the political ones are identical because both are small scale. I'm assuming an agrarian world where there is a surplus, and a surplus which has to be stored and divided and distributed and defended. In other words, as Plato already saw, it's a surplus which condemns mankind to political organization. Now, if my generalization about the primacy of coercion in politics over production is true, that gives mankind really an option, which is this one, between centralized polities and what I in a very broad sense called segmentary ones. Now, most agrarian societies are centralized in that the power is concentrated in one place. And I think the reason why this is so is fairly obvious. Namely, if you don't do it to them, they'll do it to you. And to stop them doing it to you later, you might as well eliminate them, so that in the struggle for power has a kind of quality of elimination, as in football cups or tennis tournaments, that losers are eliminated because it would be folly on the part of victors to leave them the opportunity to have another go next year. And this kind of game for elimination leads to the concentration of power in one place. And in the majority of cases, this is what happens. And this gives you one option, centralized societies. But this doesn't always happen. It's not always possible to eliminate rivals. There are exceptions to this pattern. Notably, pastoral societies are a very striking example. Mountain peasants are another. Trading cities are frequently another. There are cases where centralization is avoided and society works on the balance between segments. Now, the point about these segments, which I already made, is that they, in order to have this power, the power of cohesion, to stand up to anybody trying to centralize the society, or to stand up to each other, they tend to be multi-purpose. They embrace the life of the individual. They tend to be political, military, economic, and kin units all at the same, and of course ritual ones and religious ones all at the same time. And this is why Fustel Collonges insisted to his fellow Frenchmen, don't think in struggling for liberty, fraternity, and equality, that the ancients were your predecessors, because the ancients, even when they resisted kings, were enslaved to their rights, R-I-T-E-S, and enslaved to their cousins. And this is just roughly what the dilemma mankind lived under, enslavement either to kings or to cousins, and quite frequently to both, because in many cases these systems were mixed. So that segmental societies are in no sense, they're far too constraining and constrictive to be a civil society. But what is characteristic about them, of course, is that their belief systems, as Fouta de Coulanges and the whole Durkheimian tradition, he was Durkheim's teacher, has stressed too much, where religion is basically a system of markers and constraining, ritually, ecstatically underwritten markers for the segments of the plural coercive system. Now, one might think, as of course the ideologues of the French Revolution thought, that this kind of society, because it's participatory, because it has the rhetoric of liberty, it has a measure of equality, at least, in the case of the ancient Mediterranean city, at least in the ruling stratum, but not in the society as a whole, that it's a direct ancestor of the modern civil society that we value. But it isn't. There is no direct transition from that kind of society to civil society. What there is, not always, but what there is characteristic, and this was consumed theory, which applies particularly well, of course, to the world of Islam, but can be generalized, and Hume was equally well, of course, thinking of both the biblical history and the Reformation, an oscillation between communal pluralistic proliferation of the sacred gods in the ancient world, saints in that medieval Catholicism, which Hume, the Protestant Scot, thought of simply camouflaged paganism anyway. That kind of pluralistic, ecstatic, ritualistic religion, basically underwriting and mirroring a pluralistic social organization, an oscillation between that and what I call Ummah, namely a society of a quite different kind, where this is pluralistic religion. This is pluralistic religion. In the Ummah, religion gets centralized at least twice over. It's Unitarian in the West, at least particularly in the Abrahamic tradition, with a single, jealous, and exclusive apex, which may have been very, very, very important. And it gets crisp. It gets logically tidied up. Its center of gravity is not ritual and legend and fairy tale, but a definite doctrine. And of course, that kind of religion is transcendent twice over, in two very important senses. It gets detached from this world. It has a kind of very clear emphasis on being about an independent realm, and it's also transcendent. It's terribly important. It's transcendent socially. It's disembodied from any one particular unit. It's carried by impersonal writing. It's, of course, one of the most important facts about writing in human history, that it makes this kind of religion possible by enabling ideas and doctrines to be independent of any one carrier and speaker. Once it's written down, it doesn't belong to anyone. It's socially transcendent thanks to writing and thanks to a class of scholars, whether organized hierarchically as in the church, or not organized, or only organized in the loosest kind of way as in Islam, scholars who again are not tied to any one polity and can wander across the boundaries of polities at will. Now this is a completely different different kind of social order. In between them, of course, another type are centralized political systems not endowed with a transcendent doctrine, which are centralized politically. They may have a single ideology, but a single legitimating system, but it's not crisp, but on the contrary, it's sloppy, and it's local. So it's not local in the sense of not being transcendent, being tied to the particular the particular socio-political system over which it presides. A good example, of course, is the useful notion of Clifford Geertz of the theatrical state, where he overdoes it in that he underplays the coercive role of even that kind of state, but where the coercive role is combined with the central apparatus being kind of theatrical representation of the good life and being a theology and a model for humanity as well as the political center. He also, I think, is mistaken in somehow making it a distinctively Oriental feature. I mean, it's a strange notion. It's as if Louis XIV had never existed, or if all the theory which I mean elaborated at great lengths by Norbert Elias weren't valid. That the role of West European courts in forming the whole model of good behaviour and good conduct, as reflected, of course, in the English word courteous. But those are my criticisms. It is a very useful notion, and of course it's clearly distinct from enuma, theatrical state, any kind of patrimonial state, and of course the highly contentious and important notion of the Asiatic mode of production, of a state centralized by ecological necessity, if indeed it existed, belongs somewhere there. Now, the thinker with whom I was concerned, well, of course, Hume had this theory of mankind being doomed to this oscillation between this and that, and then the contradictions that are concerned, with which I was concerned, arises from the fact that we suddenly noticed there's also civil society, which, in virtue of its crisp and pluralized but crisp, but anyway, conceptually centralized ideological life ought to be tyrannical, but isn't. And he's a bit puzzled by that. It has a number of very interesting ad hoc arguments about how this came about. And it's odd that it's his own society, and nevertheless it's a kind of marginal counterexample which he half incorporates, and he's not normally classed amongst the kind of precursors of Weber and the people preoccupied with the role of Protestantism in the engendering of the modern world, but he most emphatically belongs there. But that's Hume's thing, this doctrine, plus a subsidiary theory about how on one occasion this led to that. And I'll come back to what the mechanism is. First, de Coulanges was concerned, of course, primarily with a version, not the most simple kind of communal society, but the classical one where the economy is plural but diverse. I mean, the simplest kind of segment of society, as classically described in Durkheim and Evans Pritchard, is of course both plural economically but homogeneous. The more complex classical city states were plural and diverse in their economy. But that's First de Coulanges was concerned with this particular transition from like 1B, from a more complex kind of communal society, to something which wasn't quite an Ummah, namely the Christian version of the Ummah, which, however, separates Caesar and God, and consequently is not quite as full an Ummah. The point is, in a way, Islam is the logical termination of the progression in the three Abrahamic monotheisms, because it's like Caesar a papist, because it unifies the religious and the political community in principle, whereas this isn't quite an Ummah, but approaches it in its theological unification, but not its political unification. And of course, the actual birth of Western civil society, meaning a society defying the state but not possessing these characteristics, where the subunits are optional, single purpose, overlapping, non-compulsive, not underwritten by ritual. That transition was this one. But anyway, Christopher Coulanges was concerned with this, and of course Tocqueville was concerned with observing in Algeria he anticipated Algeria would go the way of the West. Abdul Qadir's attempt to transform a communal society, he didn't quite distinguish. He wasn't quite sure whether it's going to go this way. The analogy with France would suggest that, or whether it would go that way. Some of his remarks suggest that he saw that it would go this way, which indeed it has, which indeed is precisely what happened. Theological unification by reformist Islam, completely transforming the world of the Marabouts, the plural religious life which had reflected the communal organization, through the erosion of the communities into a theologically standardized, puritanical, unitarian, scripturalist, exclusive type system. Well, that was Tocqueville's preoccupation. Well, that, in a way, is a re-summary of what I was saying, and what Daniel Bell very neatly summarized for me. Briefly, my vision of how that particular transition came about, which of course is essential. It's not for me to do it today because it's the biggest topic in modern sociology. But roughly speaking, what seems to have gone into that transition, and what so puzzled Hume, because it shouldn't have happened, is the following: that the Puritans and Unitarians, wanting to impose an Ummah, were defeated but not crushed. It's a terribly, overwhelmingly important that they didn't succeed in imposing a theocracy, because they tried, under Calvin and under Knox, but in the end they were defeated, and they didn't come out on top, but they weren't crushed. They still had to be reckoned with, and the fact that they had to be negotiated with, the fact that they were defeated but not crushed and had to be negotiated, converted them to toleration as an alternative to imposing God's will on society as a whole. They content themselves with imposing it within their communities, in some cases, of course, the sub-communities which then cross the Atlantic to where we are now, roughly. Their defeat, but not their complete defeat, point one. Second factor is one, of course, which John Hall and others have been exploring of late, namely the existence of a plural state system which prevented the victory of one side or another being generalized over an entire civilization, and this in particular in conjunction with the extraneous fact, extraneous from the view of sociology because it's kind of gift, that economic growth suddenly became possible and terribly important. That in the game of interstate competition, it was important not to persecute the the wealth-producing sections of your own population. Or if you did, if you expelled them, you only spited your own face, because they went and settled somewhere else, and enhanced was elsewhere. So the combination of the fact that it's more advantageous to have a civil society which was more wealth-producing than to oppress it heavily, and the fact that if you took the wrong choice, you merely helped your neighbors. It was this combination of those factors, multi-state system, importance of economic growth, a dependence on not oppressing civil society, and the fact that civil society was helped by the defeat, but not total defeat, of the Puritans who would otherwise have established Norman. Those, I think, are the main factors in producing civil society, which initially was, of course, welcomed as in human generation and Smith generation by those who lived in it. Well, all that by way of summary. Well, next, if again you'll tolerate my megalomania, a brief summary of what then happens in the next 200 in the next 200 years. This gets codified by the Enlightenment, and the prescriptions, or a set of them, an attempt is made to implement them in the French Revolution. It's like the first example of an attempt of rattrapage by a backward, or relatively backward nation, namely France, in an attempt to catch up with the Anglo-Saxons. Now, the civil society, whether understood properly, accurately or not, then turned out to be a disappointment. Roughly twice over. French Revolution leads first to terror, then to Napoleon, and the combination of good government and wealth production, welcomed by Adam Smith, leads to the dark satanic mills, and oppressed, alienated, and desperate proletariat, and the reflections on the failure of the first attempt to produce a secular ummah, namely the French Revolution, the reflections on the failure could lead to a number of theories, which, whether by accident, I don't know whether it's a historical accident or whether it was somehow in the nature of things, the most important of these attempts to rethink the secular ummah, provided design for it, is of course Marxism. Marxism has a number of important elements. First of all, the first lesson taken from the failure of the French Revolution, and indeed from the initial harsh side effects of the Industrial Revolution on the other side of the Channel, is that social life is not simply a matter of implementing ideals, but there are laws of progression. They get those laws wrong, but the idea that they have to be taken into consideration is a plausible one. Element one. Element two in Marxism, which is terribly crucial, well, it's a curious one, that Marxism is a bourgeois fantasy. It's a curious kind of it's basically the kind of ultimate apotheosis of the middle class vision of life, particularly a middle class intellectual vision of life. Namely, it's that life is about work. What characterizes good members of the middle class, as most of us in this room probably are, that we find our fulfillment in our work, and that our remuneration is relatively incidental. We don't have no objection to it, but it's basically our life derives its meaning from work, not from inherited status or from pleasure, and so on. Max Weber gave very good theories, provided good theories of why this should have happened. It's interesting to compare with, Weber with somebody like Blaise Pascal. Pascal's theory of human nature is that the desperate nature of the human situation, the inevitability of death and arbitrariness of everything, leads people, even of high status, to indulge in all kinds of divertissement, to indulge their fancy in the pursuit of a ball or learning the steps of a dance when they could be contemplating their own dignity. And his explanation is, well, they can't face the existential anguish, and that's why they go about dancing and playing tennis and so on. Not a bad theory, but the interesting thing is that for one segment of mankind found a better way of escaping the existential anguish, namely becoming workaholic. It's much more effective, at least. It's much more effective for people like us, and Weber had an ingenious theory of how this had come about, because these people were so frightened of going to hell that they tried to prove that they wouldn't go to hell by doing well in their business, and thereby broke through the dilemma that making money in pre-industrial society doesn't pay, because the barons will take your wealth from you anyway, so why bother? But these people weren't interested in money. They did it because they wanted to prove to themselves that they weren't going to go to hell, and in their attempt to prove it to themselves, then engendered modern industrial civilization. Well, anyway, that's the Weber theory, and it's ingenious and plausible. I have no idea whether it's true. I don't think anybody can be very sure. But anyway, sorry, this is a digression, but Marxism generalized this, that work, and especially highbrow work, was really the expression of human essence. And that what history was really about was production, not coercion, that production dominates, and coercion is merely a phenomenal kind of the kind of political aid to the dominant form of production. There isn't the slightest reason for believing this to be true, and I think the opposite is true. And Marx and Engels only established this by kind of sleight of hand, because they conflated two propositions, one of which highly plausible, though even that one's contentious. Namely, in opposition to Hegel, they maintained history isn't the playing out of abstractions, but the interaction of concrete men. That has a great deal of plausibility. And if that's what materialism means, it's probably true, though it's not absolutely obvious it's true. But anyway, it can be presented as a kind of obvious demystification. But they conflated that with a completely different proposition, namely that productive institutions dominate all others, including cursive ones, and there isn't the slightest reason for believing this to be true, and I'm pretty sure it's false. But anyway, that's the sort of second element, but it's a bourgeois wish fulfillment. I mean, obviously, we of the bourgeoisie are not very good at coercion. We have relatively little training in applying it or resisting it, but work, that's our business. And to be told that all history has really been about what we do, and that the thugs are merely epiphenomenal and would disappear like snow in spring, is very gratifying. It's not remotely true, but it's gratifying. So that was the second element, the need to discover the laws which will govern the implementation of those ideals, the, quote, materialist formulation of that law, which in fact was not very materialist because it denied the primary role of coercion. Well, the second element, and then in its specific content, because it had a sequence, historical sequence. It began with the sort of pre-agrarian primal community, which had idealized and wrongly supposed to be homogeneous. Then it went to the contentious, highly contentious, the Asiatic mode of production, which was sometimes in Marxism and sometimes excised because it was politically septic and because it looked too much like Stalinism, the kind of stage two. Then it went to the complex communal, which happens to be familiar in the European tradition because in those days everybody was brought up on the Greeks. From that it went to another version of the complex plural, namely feudalism, and then to civil society, and then it had to negate that. And now the negation the negation engendered the scheme of the new secular Ummah, which had the formal qualities of the previous Ummah, namely that a social order is to come, which is the implementation of an ideal, of an absolutely formulated ideal, which, well, in principle, production was to be plural, because everybody in the famous, one of the few passages we have which tells us what it's going to be like is that preposterous passage in the German ideology about fishing, hunting, gathering in, fishing, hunting, cattle breeding, and criticizing in the evening, but without any timetable. I mean, basically, Marx is a vision, the absence of timing. It's a kind of Marx's vision of the good life, a kind of extrapolation of the early 19th century Bohemia, as opposed to the Philistine version of Burgers. I mean, he incorporated the bourgeois valuation of work and work as self-expression, but without any timetables. So in theory, there was going to be there wasn't going to be any unification on the ideological side either, because the truth would simply shine out after all the mystifications of the early ideologies had been eliminated, like fog disappearing in the morning sun. Similarly, there's going to be no coercion, and there's going to be pluralism here, but no property, because the definition of this
second and secular Ummah had to be the negation of what had preceded.
In practice, of course, it meant
Absolute property meant,
in a complex industrial society, the unification of the entire production under a single apex.
and that single apex also embraced the state,
which of course couldn't wither away as anticipated,
and of course also
embraced the ideological apparatus. So it here's something more than
the Caesaro-Papism of the original Ummah.
the original Ummah was Caesaro-Papist in that it unified in the Caliph, the political and theological authority was combined, and the community was simultaneously political and religious. But it was, although Islam was preoccupied with justice, and the job of the state is to promote good and suppress evil, justice is conceived in a sociologically rather naive way, as in terms of the existing economic institutions, rather than in a sociologically sophisticated way, as Marxism did, which of course was very aware of the fact that the patterns, the economic framework within which justice was to operate varied a great deal.
So anyway, the consequence was something there's no good name for it.
Caesaro-Papist Mammonist, if you like, the kind of fusion of three hierarchies into a single one.
Anyway, that basically is in the
most important attempt to think out what had gone wrong with early industrialism, what had gone wrong with the French Revolution,
and so forth.
Now, this acquired the near monopoly, not the monopoly, but the kind of preeminent hegemonic role in social criticism already by the end of the 19th century, and of course in the 20th century came to be applied. So that for the first time in human history there were the purely secular Ummah, and of course
it went disastrously wrong. Now the question is, why did that particular secular Ummah,
why they're doing so badly, and we saw it collapse last year,
whereas the first one is doing so well? Well, I try to give an answer to this, why the Ummah in the literal sense is doing well. Now the question of why is this one
doing so desperately badly? Well, one can have a number of hypotheses about this, and I can only present them to you
because I don't think any of us, we can't just separate the
threads. This is the first time it's been tried. It's the first time it's dramatically failed, and we can see the various elements in it which may be responsible for the failure. Either that idiocracy in a inherently unstable, growing industrial society where the growth depends on cognitive growth, and where consequently a part of society has to be, the people who invent the new scientific and technological ideas which lead to the economic growth are trained in the assumption that truth is there to be discovered and is not already known definitively. Either a fundamental strain between the need for a rapidly growing science and technology and the claim at the availability of definitive truth, which is, of course, part of the Ummah. So it's very strong, of course, in the Islamic version, which has not only absolute truth, but the truth is self-completed. The Prophet, the seal of the Prophet, so the termination of the process. Any subsequent additions have to be smuggled in, or otherwise are inherently heretical.
So if completion, the availability of a crisply defined
truth about the world is part of an idiocracy, there may be an inherent tension between that and
of course the economic base of the
society itself, which hinges for its legitimacy on growth, and the growth depends on scientific technological innovation. Possibility one. Possibility two, not only ideology as such, idiocracy as such is incompatible, the fact that the idiocracy is resolutely immanentist, anti-transcendentalist. Well, for one thing, the kind of contradiction between the requirements of rational production and the requirements of social order is something that was much explored recently in the work of our chairman of this evening, of Dan Bell. I'm looking forward to his comment on that. The second possibility is that the immanentism exposes the ideology to testing far more than a formally transcendentalist doctrine, which as such isn't available to immediate testing. I wouldn't make too much of this. It's a logical point, but as anyone who thought about what happens when prophecy fails knows, people aren't too upset by the refutations of their ideologies. If they want to go on believing, they go on believing, so that the epistemological this-worldliness of Marxism, I wouldn't consider a desperate weakness. Thirdly, the fact that the unit of salvation, so to speak, for Marxism is not the individual, but the human collectivity as a whole, which has a number of curious consequences. Marxism has nothing to say to a person in individual distress or despair, and it doesn't provide any sort of handrails through life for individuals. And notoriously, one of the difficulties Marxist societies face in ritualizing life. I mean, there are obvious rituals, the May Day parade and the October Revolution stuff and so on. But it's collective and it's not all that successful. The paradox about this is that if the Augustans had been right, Marxism ought to be doing terribly well. I mean, they admired the religion of classical antiquity, the religion of this stage, precisely for the fact that it was civic and not, like Christianity, egotistic, and that it was this worldly and not, like Christianity, heavily oriented towards another world, that the religion of the Greeks had taught them to be good citizens in this world, rather than be preoccupied with the salvation of their individual little souls in some other world. They thought it was a terribly good thing, and if it were really socially effective, Marxism really scores very well by those criteria, but it doesn't seem to do all that well. Its collectivism and its civic stress hasn't done it much good, and the factor which I suspect is the weightiest is precisely that its doctrine, in practice, leads to this triple unification of the social functions in a single hierarchy, and this works has been shown to work extremely badly. It wasn't totally obvious that it would work terribly badly. As late as the age of Khrushchev, it was still possible for Marxists to believe that even if the first industrialization was carried out by individualists, when it comes to the rattrapage industrializations, the collective method will do better, will involve less suffering, be fast and so on. Turned out not to be so, that the overstretching of authority by the unification of all three functions in one hierarchy has in the end turned out to be disastrous. And I think this is very conclusively established by now, because it's no longer the attempt to blame it on special circumstances really doesn't carry no conviction by now, because it's roughly the same has happened to different degrees in so many different countries. There's quite different traditions, not all of them politically linked to each other often, and some of them. I think the overstretching of the task imposed on a single hierarchy, and the fact that people locked in the productive system have to behave as members of single hierarchies do have to behave, namely look to their position within that hierarchy rather than to their instrumental effectiveness, which is what productive life seems to require. I think this in conjunction with an ideology which stresses economic success, collective economic success as a criterion, has led to the downfall, to the demoralization and dismantling from within of the system. Now, where can it go from there? In my sketch of the main planks in the Marxist structure, what I didn't include is, of course, one very, very central idea, namely its doctrine that civil society was a fraud. And, of course, in the sense in which they meant it, they were, of course, right. Because the point is, civil society works because they're the complex of institutions which prejudges the, quote, democratic decisions which people make within that thing. If democracy were really, as this naively sometimes conceived being, as people arriving from outer space and independently deciding how they're going to organize their life, it would be hopelessly volatile, because people would vote with each fashion and mood and so on. The actual concrete working of civil society hinges on all the sort of the bank of custom, the institutional rigidities, the old habits which make it less volatile than it otherwise would be. And that, of course, was always the charge from the left against civil society, to the fraudulent, that under the appearance of neutrality, there are all kinds of institutional devices for keeping things roughly in the way they're going. Well, the irony is, of course, that when this kind of society has now collapsed, what they're desperately, if only we could have that fraudulence. It's a desperate pursuit of all those institutional supports and rigidities and connections which have made civil society work, and of course the dilemma facing that attempt to recover civil society is, well, the number of dilemmas, is that it's very, very difficult to erect this quickly. The trouble about civil society is it's like being happy or falling in love or something. It's very unclear whether you can have it deliberately. I mean, John Stuart Mill, who was committed to a philosophy which made happiness a criterion of the good life, and plausibly enough say, what's life about other than happiness, found in his depression that you can't aim at happiness directly, or if you do, it's self-defeating. You've got to aim at something else, and happiness must come as a byproduct. And I think similarly, with other emotional experiences, and civil society seems to be like that. It's not at all obvious. I mean, that its creation, because at long last it's been discovered to be desirable, that the fraudulence is desired, that it nevertheless, that you can bring it about. The desperate attempt to do so, this is what perestroika is about. Whether it will succeed, nobody knows. And of course, you may say I'm giving a slightly idealized account of perestroika, because it's partly, is it about the re-establishment of civil society, or is it about the acquisition of wealth? Well, of course, it's about both. If the wealth had been forthcoming, as was expected under the system of the secular Ummah, perestroika, of course, wouldn't have happened. And of course, what people partly, those committed to, or those supporting it, partly what they want is the achievement of something like the Western affluent, but they also, I think, want the civil society. In what proportion, it's very difficult to say. And the two things are so intertwined, you certainly won't get civil society unless there is a measure of affluence. If the economic collapse, if the economic deterioration continues, or of course a fortiori, if it worsens into it. When the period of zeal diminishes, the society fluctuates back again in this direction, and in the political sphere, the combination of respect for the central law seems to be combined with an acceptance of patronage and mafia politics, much more willingly, partly, I suppose, because there aren't such great aspirations in this sphere. But the secular Ummah does not seem to be able to live with its own routinization, which was indeed extremely sleazy
and unattractive in the Brezhnev period, and moreover is frightened of slipping into a kind of criminalization, i.e. Coercive government without any attempt at serious justification and indifference to the economy, a kind of nuclear Haiti, which is what communist society might well become. Well, I've given you the possible explanations of why, the explanations that I can think of, why the second and secular Ummah, which has arisen out of the, in a sense, valid doctrine of the fraudulence of civil, liberal, bourgeois society, why it has failed, which obviously so dramatically has failed. Perhaps I'm exaggerating the inevitability of this process with hindsight. I certainly didn't foresee it. No one else did either. But it has happened. Now that it happened, in the usual kind of social science way, we're offering ex post explanations. At this point, I hand over to Dan.
Thank you very much, Ernest. There's going to be a session tomorrow, I think, with some students, is that right? Where some of you can explore this in more specific detail. But we have some time now for questions from the audience. And the usual procedure is, if I can see a hand against the light. Nobody here should be very bashful, I think, because Ernest and I share a bond. We both come out of a Talmudic tradition, you see, of the rabbi who says, I've got an answer. Who's got a question? Well, let me ask one then, since I... Pardon? Yes.
I'm trying to be very brave, do the other people's job to ask a question. You started your talk last night by pointing at the similarities of Muslim and Marxist societies as far as having weak civil societies and strong states. Now, based on your exposition of Islam and so on, it's not clear to me how you conceptualize the present state of Islam and the weakness of civil society. Is Islam with its peculiarities congruent with modern conditions, as you have repeatedly stated? Is the pendulum swinging again, as you once stated that it has stopped back in 1971? And is it possible, this is the last part of my first question, is it possible that the civil society is weak in these Islamic societies because the state is weak and doesn't have enough autonomy due to the peculiarities of Islam itself? Not because the state is strong, but Islam is weak. That's the first leg of my question. Second leg is, I must dare say that I'm somewhat disappointed by your exposition of Marxist societies and Marxist ideology. For instance, on time, I'm sure you know very well that Marx spent plenty of time. Chapter 6 of Capital is on working time. If you read the third volume, there's plenty of discussions of time. And I think Marx is very unique as far as paying incredible amount of time on time and space and so on. And German ideology is, sort of marginal to Marx's systematic writings. So that's one aspect. And as far as your exposition of civil society and so on today, I don't find anything that is path-breaking as far as the discussions that go on today. And I don't see how you relate that to the original point that you mentioned in the beginning as far as the weakness of civil society and the strength of the state. How do you see the process as far as the transformations of perestroika and so on in reshaping the relationship between the two?
Well, I'm not sure I understood all that went into all the varied material which went into that question. I think the one point about the pendulum swinging, Well, I don't think the pendulum is continuing to swing. My belief is that the pendulum has got unhinged, that Hume was right. Under the traditional order and a fairly stable economy, the pendulum was swinging between theocratic centralism and religious pluralism. It went on swinging under modern conditions. It's basically got unhinged because the modern colonial and post-colonial state simply possesses the military and administrative means for destroying the local communities. It doesn't allow those communal organizations to exist, with one or two exceptions. I mean, in North Yemen, the tribes are stronger now than they were under the Imam, and in the Lebanon, the communities are stronger vis-a-vis the state. There ain't no state left to speak of. But by and large, the state is strong, and consequently, the social base for the religious pluralism has been eroded, and that is my main explanation of why Islam has shifted now to this reformed, puritanical, Unitarian, scripturalist version. Now, I don't understand to that extent, the pendulum is no longer swinging, and I think has got probably permanently unhinged. I don't understand what you say. What you mean when you say the state is weak. Virtually all Muslim states today are heavily politically centralized. One or two of them are pluralist, but in a fairly superficial way. Like Morocco, and there are with the erosion of the tribal opposition to the centre, there is very weak other institutional opposition to it. Politics is a kind of winner-take-all system where those who get power hold it, and usually hold it by network. I mean, it's domination by competing networks who, when they win, eliminate the rivals as far as they can. That's roughly the pattern of Muslim politics. So I mean, our vision of the facts seems to disagree, and that's about all I can say in response to your question.
Yes. Sorry, I don't think we can hear you. Could you take the microphone?
I'd be extremely rude and ask you to read everything that is on the board because I missed half of the lecture. I couldn't read what you wrote there. It's...
Sorry, I don't think there's time for that.
Well,
I'm just reading it wouldn't help. I'd have to explain it. Not to explain it, I have to give the lecture again. And I think
well, maybe perhaps you should have done it in the first place because most of us missed it.
Some people hear, some people see, some people speak. Yes, question.
Professor Gellner, I was thoroughly impressed by the breadth of your presentation, and the one small question I have really is, it remains on how you use the term civil society, which is your controlling notion here. And it seems to me that, from what I gather, you're picking up this notion partly from the Scottish Enlightenment and the debate that took place among several of the thinkers of the period. Your preference is for Hume, but there were other people talking about civil society at the time. And when discussing Hume and civil society in terms of the Scottish Enlightenment, you focus on economic production and belief system. And this is one definition of it, at least the one that I picked up most systematically throughout your talk. Then around the same time, or I should say a bit later on, the German Romantics started also talking about civil society, and there I suppose Hegel, and that's this notion of moral community, which would fit under your belief, your category of belief. And I suppose today, among the Italian Marxists, namely Gramsci, there was the notion of hegemony and persuasion, which also again fits under your notion of belief. And so coming out of this, we get the definition of civil society being a place for production and belief and the generation of belief. Now, if this is, the reason I find this puzzling is because Alexis de Tocqueville, who you also mentioned, is somebody who thought that he created a third category, which I think in some ways is useful for what you're trying to do, in the sense that he distinguishes very clearly between production, which is the realm of exploitation, the distribution of goods, and really political society, which is the realm of where contestation takes place and solidarity gets generated among groups. Now, the reason I think this is important is because I think implicit in what you're trying to do is the claim that somehow political democracy has some kind of organic tie, either direct or indirect, to markets. Now, I would like to get a statement from you whether, in fact, you think this is the case. What is the relationship between markets and the possibilities for democratization? Is there indeed a one-to-one correspondence, or could it just be that it was a conjunctural condition that happened in the Western world that was rather, it happened by fluke, and now in retrospect we have grown accustomed to associating the two?
Well, there are two parts to that question, and the first one is based on complete misapprehension. You say concerning what I want to do with the notion of civil society. No, I should have said that in so many words. I didn't want to connect it either with the 17th or 18th century uses of the term. The whole prehistory of that expression doesn't particularly interest me, nor its connection, which may be slightly more relevant to Gramsci. I was simply trying to make explicit what underlies the notion. I mean, civil society has become a great slogan in the past 10 or 15 years in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. What it is they mean by it. Now, they mean primarily a plural society where there are centers of influence and power other than the state and strong enough to defy the state. But that's not sufficient, because that would also cover segmentary sub-communities, but which don't have that quality in fact, where they have that, as in the mafias of the Soviet Mezzogiorno, they don't like that all that much either. What they want is countervailing forces which don't have this quality of being total communities, of embracing a man's ritual kinship life, his marital, his selection of marital partners, all the other things which old communities had. But on the contrary, associations which are ad hoc, optional, non-ritualized, and all the rest of it. That's partly what they mean, and which incidentally are not committed to an overall total justification of a society as a whole, but which have this in common with civil society, that we are crisp but pluralist, i.e., we recognize the law of excluded middle. We're not like the sloppy pluralists of segmental societies whose legends and rituals have no coherence at all, where you could say where the law of excluded middle simply doesn't apply, that we've acquired, I think my guess is that it's exclusive Jehovah who really taught mankind the law of excluded middle, and that we have learned that lesson, but at the same time are pluralists in that multiple views are tolerated, and that performance of civic duties does not hinge on an overall ideology. The dismantling of ideology, the end of ideology, which Dan Bell discussed in the Connection of West, has really come to roost in Eastern Europe. They don't want a new counterpicture. They don't want to go through. The second Ummah, the heavenly city of the 18th century philosophers, was already a reaction to the loss of the first total vision, of the religious vision. They don't, on the whole, they don't want a third one. They don't want one at all. A kind of pragmatic muddling is, I think, going to be the ideological cover of the perestroika, if it is successful, which I pray it will be. Anyway, this is what I mean by civil society. I was trying to make explicit what they want: a plural, but not segmentary, nor absolutist, ideocratic social order. And I really want to disconnect it. Gramsci plays some kind of part in what they, mainly because it's something they know about, but I'm really not interested in the history of that expression.
Yes, sir.
Would you care to speculate about the stability of our present societies, our Western societies, as we know them, including perhaps the Asians that are now coming up and so forth? Stability, are we in for troubles too?
Yes, but I prefer not to. I mean, thank you. I mean, I think we are in for trouble, but I don't think anything.
Let me try a last question, Ernest. In a curious way, a defense of Marx. At least to go back to my youthful heritage in my old age. The way you've set up the problem seems to me quite clear that the answer is convincing. Namely that what you call both the Muslim and the Marxist societies are theocratic systems which fuse coercion and belief, and unify them and try to impose them in a unitary way. The strength of any religious system, particularly Islam, is that it promises the hereafter, therefore can't be tested in the present world, and we have no way of bridging that. Whereas the secular world always has the test in the terms of performance, and when you get a more complex world where you have to be more adaptive to the rapid technology, you begin to fail. In the early years, the so-called Marxist systems had limited objectives and could achieve that in a crash course way. So it seems to me that the way you've set it up is quite true. A theocratic system unifying power and coercion and production and belief in the contemporary world is bound to fall apart. My defense of Marxism is curious in this respect, and it's not meant as a cheat even, I think quite seriously. Namely, it's not Marxism that's involved here, it's the Soviet Union, and it's the Leninist version of the Soviet Union. And the proposition I put forth is that the Russian Revolution was the wrong revolution at the wrong time, in the wrong place, led by the wrong people. And we've been paying for it in the last 70, 80 years. I think Marx is perfectly right in saying that socialism is only possible at the end of capitalism, when you've solved certain problems. After all, Marx did believe in the end of coercion, namely the withering away of the state. He believed in the end of production, which is the disutility of work, so that people could have leisure. And he believed in a sense of the demystification of religious veils and religious beliefs. So to some extent, therefore, I think it may be a misnomer to call this Marxist societies, and therefore what I'd like to do is simply place Marxism once again in the status of religion, and therefore leave it as a shining ideal in its own right.
No, I mean, it doesn't work. I feel that all that was wrong with it, that it happened that it was implemented in a relatively backward country which had its industrialization to achieve, but hadn't yet achieved it, or it achieved it in concentrated pocket around Petrograd and so on. Where the unification of the three functions was attempted in relatively advanced industrial societies, it also didn't work. Eastern Germany, the East Germany, the western parts of Czechoslovakia, both of them entered the communist world as members of the advanced club and emerged from it retarded. It really doesn't work. Even the centralization of the three functions doesn't work. I mean, I would defend Marx in a somewhat different way, that he didn't actually envisage a centralized economic system or a centralized system in any place. But he was wrong there as well. I mean, he's doubly wrong. That if you were the big lesson of the whole experiment is, if you abolish private property, you end up with a single hierarchy covering both polity and economy, and that in turn turns out to be disastrous. Now, his premises led to that. He didn't wish to. It wasn't a conclusion which he wanted, but in fact, it's a corollary of his premises, and to that extent he's wrong, and I don't accept your defense of him.
Let me say in conclusion, I'm not going to argue the case other than to recall an old episode. I think it was attributed to many people. I recall it from Harold Lasky when he was giving a lecture on the 100th anniversary of the Communist Manifesto, And when he got into the debate, he said, well, you can interpret Marx in your way, I'll interpret it in his. Thank you very much for an extraordinary evening.